On overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with a treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
What is going on in the economy? We have now seen the CPI for April, the annual rate, increase. Does this mean that interest rates are going to stay at reasonably high levels? We talk to Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business every week on the program. Good morning, Leith.
G'day, Clinton. How are you?
Good, mate. CPI up. Was that in line with market expectations?
No, mate. It was actually slightly higher. So economists had tipped that inflation would rise by, I think it was 3.4% annually, and instead that's in the year to April. Instead, we got a 3.6% increase. So it was slightly higher than economists' expectations. And the more important figure, which the RBA looks at, is what's called core inflation. So that's underlying inflation. That rose by 4.1%, which was slightly up on 4% in March. So basically, the Australia's monthly CPI indicator. So it's not as broad as the quarterly one that gets released every quarter, but it's supposed to give us sort of like a real time view on how inflation's tracking. What it basically shows is that inflation is more stubbornly higher than what economists and the RBA wanted, which is obviously not good news. But at the same time, the Reserve Bank has effectively two roles. So first of all, it's trying to balance what's called price stability, which is obviously inflation, with full employment, which is basically the economy. And while this higher inflation, would point to the potential of interest rate hikes, other things equal, the problem is the economy is also slowing a lot faster than what the Reserve Bank expected. So this week, in fact, on Tuesday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released retail sales data for April, which collapsed to its lowest level in more than 3 decades if you take out the brief period during the lockdowns. And annual growth in retail sales came in at only 1.3% in the 12 months to April. So that might sound like growth. Problem is that's against CPI inflation of about 3.6% and population growth of circa 2.5%. So what that basically tells you is that retail sales in per capita terms, once you adjust for inflation, it actually fell by 4.5% in the year to April, which is a massive fall. And this basically continued this long run of weak economic data that we've had over the past month. So we've obviously seen the unemployment rate tick up quite sharply. We've got falling real wage growth. So the wage price index came out early in the month, and that was a shocker. And also a whole raft of business activity indicators like the NAB Business Survey basically show that the economy is slowing a lot faster than what the Reserve Bank and what economists expected. So basically this per capita recession that we've been in for, I think it's 3 quarters now in a row, is going to extend into a fourth quarter once the March quarter data releases. And if anything, the economy is getting worse. So because of that, yes, the inflation's a little bit higher than what they expected, and some economists are saying that the Reserve Bank's now going to hike interest rates. I don't subscribe to that view at all because the economy is also tanking a lot faster than what the Reserve Bank expected. So effectively, it's a bit of yin and yang, and because of that, I think the Reserve Bank's going to keep interest rates on hold for the foreseeable future, and I still think the next move is going to be down once the economy keeps weakening.
So that term that you used there, per capita recession, that we're in at the moment. And Simon Kennedy, the new Liberal member for Cook, made the same comments during the week. That effectively means, doesn't it, that without this record migration, we would certainly be in a recession.
Oh, absolutely. The most recent sort of national accounts GDP data that we've got is only to the December quarter. So we've only got it for the last calendar year, and what it showed is that in per capita terms, Australia's GDP growth fell by 1%. And it's actually worse than that because the household sector, which is the economy that we live in, so not businesses, not government, household expenditure actually fell by 2.5%, and household incomes per capita fell by 6% last year. So the household sector, so that's the consumer side of the economy, which makes up about 60% of the economy usually, on average over the long term, is hemorrhaging really hard. And the only thing that's keeping the economy is basically giving off this illusion of growth is the fact that we've got such strong population growth through immigration. So effectively, the economic pie is still growing very slowly, but everyone's share of the pie is actually shrinking, which is not good for living standards.
Certainly not. In a time when you're facing economic challenges, there are often suggestions of tax reform, but tax reform is usually difficult, and politicians have trouble actually committing to tax reform. Do you think it's time to increase the level of the GST in terms of significant reform?
Oh, absolutely. Look, Australia has one of the most, reliant tax systems in the world on personal income taxes. So we collect an inordinate amount of, revenue from income taxes at the same time as the percentage of workers in the economy continues to shrink. And it's shrinking because we've obviously got an ageing population, and we've got the big baby boomer bulge is entering retirement. So we're effectively, squeezing a diminishing pool of workers, with higher taxes to try and fund everything else. And it's just not right. And that's one of the reasons why the government keeps trying to run this big migration program, because it's basically trying to import taxpayers instead of the sensible solution, which is to broaden the tax base. And one way you do that is through GST. Another one is we could start taxing our resources properly, like they do in other countries, like Norway, Qatar, etc., which raise tens and tens of billions of dollars in extra revenue through taxing their resource industry properly. We don't do that over here. So as a result, we are incredibly highly dependent on personal income taxes, which is just smashing working Australians. And, the problem here is, Clinton, working Australians have been hammered by a triple whammy over the past few years. So first of all, working Australians have been hit, obviously, by this massive rise in interest rates, which has smashed mortgage holders. We've also been smashed by rising rents, which has smashed tenants. And they've also been smashed by soaring income tax payments because we've had this huge bracket creep over the past year or so, which has lifted everyone into high average tax rates. So they've been hit three times. And that's those three factors are the primary reason why Australian households suffered the world's biggest decline in real household disposable income last year. So Australian households per capita, real household disposable income fell by 6% last year, which was, an enormous fall, the worst in the world. And at the same time, working households have also experienced a really sharp rise in their cost of living. Part of that's because of this rent and mortgage story. So according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, their living cost index, which was released earlier this month for March, rose by 6.5% in the year to March for working households, which is nearly double the CPI inflation rate of 3.6% and wage growth of 4.1%. Now, the crazy thing about this is that while working Australians are getting squeezed by those three factors, older Australians are actually travelling pretty well. So the older Australians, I'm talking about, I don't want to pick on a generation, but it's sort of, if you imagine the baby boomer generation and above, they typically own the homes outright. Therefore, they've been untouched for the most part by surging mortgage repayments, surging rents, and the surge in personal income taxes because most of them no longer work. And the cost of living index, that same one that was released by the ABS, showed that for, say, retirees and age pensioners, their cost of living only rose by 3.4% and 3.3%, respectively, in the year to March, which is actually below inflation. So you've got working Australians getting hammered by the cost of living going up at nearly double the inflation rate, and you've got older Australians where it's basically going up by slightly less than inflation. And some survey data was released earlier this month by CBA, and that was based on payments into CBA bank accounts. So CBA controls nearly a third of the nation's bank accounts because it's the largest bank in the country, so it's a really good sample. And what it showed is that younger Australians are spending less than inflation in the last year, so they've suffered a real cut in their expenditure, which is why these retail sales have fallen. But Australians aged over the age of 60 have actually spent more than the CPI inflation rate in the last year. So their expenditure has gone up in real terms. And this spending by older Australians is actually helping to keep the CPI inflation higher than it would otherwise be because we've got more spending in the economy. And that's then preventing the Reserve Bank from lowering interest rates, which is then hurting younger Australians again. So all this basically shows you is that Australia should raise the GST to 15% in exchange for lower income taxes. And if you did that, the government would be able to tax more of the spending by wealthy older Australians by dragging more of their spending into the tax net. At the same time, it'd be able to reduce the reliance on personal income taxes and also slow spending and aggregate demand in the economy. And anyone who's out there thinking, oh, no, don't raise the GST because that's really bad for people in lower incomes and fixed incomes, well, you can compensate those people with direct fiscal transfers to make them no worse off. So I think raising the GST to 15% is a hell of a lot fairer than continually punishing 1/3 of Australians carrying mortgages with high interest rates to try and tame inflation, as well as punishing working Australians with forever higher income taxes. It's just a much fairer option, and it broadened the tax base, and I think it's something we need to do. And more importantly, we need to tax our resources properly. I think that's even more important.
Tell me this, though, just lastly. If you were to increase the GST, could you actually then reform state taxes? Because I still recall when John Howard first proposed the GST, or when it was proposed in the 1990s, the whole idea of it was to eliminate state taxes, basically, even stamp duty. But we've still got plenty of them, whether it's payroll tax, stamp duty, or other levies.
Oh, yeah, and to be fair, stamp duty is one of the worst taxes going around. I'd love to see that go as well. I mean, look, in an ideal world, I'd like to see GST at 20% if you can get rid of all those things and also reduce income tax. But I guess the broader point is we've got a really unfair tax system at the moment, which is just smashing, a shrinking pool of Australians that are working and are actually being productive, and they're getting their taxes forever hiked at the same time as those same people tend to be the ones who have got the mortgages who are getting smashed by high mortgage rates to try and tame inflation, and then rents and everything else, while, older Australians who own the homes outright effectively are basically not being harmed by any of these things and are not paying enough tax. And I just think that's fundamentally unfair, and the tax system does need to be broadened to get this reliance off personal income taxes. And consumption tax through GST is one way to do it, and the other one, which I argue is actually more important, is again we've got to tax our resources properly, because Australia is one of the world's biggest, resource exporters, in energy and all sorts of things, iron ore and coal, etc. And we just don't tax it properly, and so we have these large multinational companies, making oodles of money off our resources at the same time as, when it comes to energy, for example, gas, they're also gouging us with high prices. And, if we just simply follow other countries like Norway and Qatar and other countries that, sell similar goods to the world, they raise a hell of a lot of money from these same exports. And as a result, they're not struggling for tax revenue like we do. And then our response is to continually whack personal income, workers harder through personal income taxes. It's just back to front.
Takes politicians with a fair bit of guts and intestinal fortitude to embark on that sort of tax reform. Wonder whether we've actually got them.
Yeah, unfortunately, mate, that's always the problem. And of course, if they try and go down try to do these things, they have all the vested interest screaming. And I can just see it now, mate. If they argue to raise the GST, have the Greens, etc., saying, "Oh, this is bad for the poor, this is bad for the poor," blah blah blah, because it's what they call a regressive tax, because the poor spend more money on a higher share of their incomes on expenditure, therefore they'll get taxed more. But again, you can compensate those people. So now, for example, if you're on job seeker or you're on the age pension, you can just increase their payments to compensate for the extra GST they'd pay, and then they'd be no worse off. You can do the same through income tax relief or direct transfers to someone on a low income. You give them a rebate every year. But there are ways around this stuff to make it fairer, but it is kind of ridiculous that we've got the wealthiest people in the country who are spending, quite frankly, like drunken sailors, based on the data, who don't have mortgages, aren't suffering on the rental market and aren't paying personal income taxes. They're effectively, spending big, helping to keep inflation higher than it otherwise would be, at the same time as the Reserve Bank's trying to slow the economy. And the easy solution there is to lift the GST so that we have higher consumption taxes, so we pull more of that spending into the net, rather than just whacking personal workers through personal income taxes, which is grossly unfair in my view.
Yeah, just one portion of the economy. Good to talk to you, Leith. We'll catch up next week.
Thanks, Glenn. See ya.
Leith Van Osselen from Macro Business.